Good afternoon and welcome once more to Bookworms. I'm Marilyn Bizade, and with me in the studio I have Graham Bernard again.
Hello,
Graham, we've been bookworming together quite a bit, haven't we? So this afternoon again we have two quite different books to talk about, and I'm going to start off with a book that I'm quite closely connected with at the moment. It's the book that the musical Mats is in the middle of rehearsals for, and we are doing the show called Ladies in Black, which comes from the book that was written by Madeline St. John called The Women in Black. And it's a fascinating book. It's lovely, it's warm, it's very much an insight into life in 1950s Australia. And I'll just read you a little bit about the author. Madeline St. John was born in Sydney in 1941, and her father was a barrister and a politician. And her mother actually committed suicide in 1954 when Madeline was 12, and she said that her death sort of changed everything for her. But she studied art at Sydney University, where her contemporaries included Germaine Greer, Clive James, and a few like that. And she married a fellow called Chris Tillham, and they moved to the United States. And then the marriage ended, but she settled in England in Notting Hill, and she worked on a series of odd jobs. And then in 1993 published her first novel, The Women in Black, and this was the only book that she set in Australia. And The Women in Black has then become a musical called Ladies in Black, and that has been adapted by Carolyn Burns and Tim Finn. Tim Finn's written the music for it, and it's based on the novel. So the novel is quite charming. It's set in the 1950s, and you can imagine in 1950s Australia. And it follows different threads of different characters in the book. And the main character is Lisa, or her real name is Leslie, but she wants to be called Lisa. And Lisa is going to work at Goods. Now, Goods is a department store, a little bit like a Harrods, and she's going to work there over the holidays. But she's very bright. But of course, she comes from a sort of a middle-class family, and in those days, girls did not go to university. And so she was an only child. Her father was a compositor on the Herald and was rarely to be seen, generally arriving home in the wee small hours, sleeping till the afternoon, and going off to a pub to drink beer for an hour or two until it was time to go to work. During his waking hours on Saturday, he glued himself to the wireless to listen to the racing, having placed several off-course bets. Mrs. Miles had not the slightest idea of the size of his salary, and would have been stunned if anyone had told her. If she'd known how great a proportion of it ended up in the pockets of the off-course bookmakers, she would have fainted dead away. She'd not known him well when they married during the war. He was a handsome soldier at a dance she'd attended, and when he had suggested, after a brief acquaintance, they make a go of it, she'd seen no reason at all to say no. And she had until then had quite a hard life. She'd been born into a bakery business and had been covered with flour since the age of 11. And so it sort of gives you the background of the family. Lisa, however, was a little bit strange in the fact that she was very bright. And at school she was discovered as quite bright, and her English teacher sort of persuaded her to work even harder, and sort of came into the staff room one day and said, "First class honours, dear, definitely." And so they pushed her into that. And it was the primary purpose of every teacher in the school to produce as many first-class honours results in the leaving certificate exam as humanly possible. So when Lisa first arrives at Goods, she's waiting for the results of the leaving. And of course that means that she's very bright. compared to all the others there. Filling in the application form for the leaving the Commonwealth Scholarship at any matter, not unproblematical. Well, I don't know, Leslie, said her mother. I don't know about the university. We'll have to see what your dad says. He's got to sign it anyway. They managed to corner him just as he began to go off one evening to the Sydney Morning Herald. No daughter of mine is going anywhere near that cesspit, said he, and that's final. By the end of the following week, he'd agreed to give his signature on the form of understanding that if his daughter were to, by some extreme chance, actually to gain the scholarship, there would nonetheless be no question whatsoever of her taking it up. Well, it's for the school, really, said Mrs. Miles. They want her to do it for the schools. It's good for their record. Yes, well, said E. Miles, compositor. I don't want her going to that school anyway. A lot of stuck-up snobs. and this follows through, and it does follow through in the musical, where she's she has these sort of adventures when she goes to Goods, and she chums up with Magda. Now, Magda is a Hungarian refugee who has come out from after the war, and she's married Stefan, who's another one, a refugee, and of course they're quite different. They're very exotic, and for some reason Magda takes Lisa under her wing, and she's actually calls herself Lisa. Her name is really Leslie. She doesn't like Leslie because it's a boy's name, and of course this creates problems at home as well too.
Only her mother that calls her Leslie, probably.
Yes, that's right. And so Magda is in model gowns. And Magda is beautiful, and she's very exotic, and the other girls are not quite sure about Magda, but for some reason she gets on very well with Lisa, and she invites her home to her house, and then she invites her to a New Year's Eve party, and suddenly Lisa has gone into this amazing different world, and of course the parents can't quite work out, and when she comes home a bit late one night, they really get stuck into her, and that's particularly in the show, that's what happens. And there's a little bit here about Magda and Stefan has sat up very late playing cards with two friends on the Sunday night before the first Monday in December. And by the time Magda had cleared away the dirty glasses, emptied the ashtrays, and generally straightened the living room, and then made her démaquillage, it was past 2 a.m. She stood and looked out at Mossman Bay for a moment and sighed, and retired to bed. Stefan was reading a page of Nietzsche, as was his wont, last thing at night. "Ah, Magda, my beloved," said he, flinging aside his book, "a woman's work is never done until I am almost asleep myself. Come into bed now." "There is no law in this country," said Magda, "against men helping their wives to clear up the messes there." "As a matter of fact," said Stefan, "I think there is." "You're probably right." And so she gets up in the morning and she has to spend quite a bit of time getting herself organised because she's had this late night. And it will not be imagined that Magda wore the regulation Goods black frock. You see, all the ladies in the shop have to wear black while presiding over model gowns. No, in this matter, as in several others, a compromise had been achieved, whereby Magda agreed to wear black, but on her own terms. She'd acquired a collection of suitable black frocks and what she called costumes, many of which were relieved, not to say enhanced, by discreet addition of white, collars it might be, or cuffs, or both, or even, in the case of one costume, pale pink, all of which had been carefully purchased by Magda from the sort of expensive little shops which she preferred to patronise at a large trade discount, further subsidised, as per their agreement, by Goods. "When I was vendeuse at Patou," Magda remarked, "I wore nothing but Patou, naturally." This was an absolute whopper, because in the first place, Magda had never been a vendeuse at Patou. However she might have been, it was a good and serviceable story which had as much as anything else she had to say which secured her the job of taking the charge of the model gowns. So she takes charge of model gowns, and then they have a friend, she and Stefan, called Rudy. And Rudy is a younger guy, and Rudy has arrived from Melbourne, and he's looking for a wife. And so this is another story, because he ends up becoming engaged to Faye, who's one of the girls at Goods. And Faye's been looking for a husband for quite a while, and she never seems to find the right man. There's always something wrong with them, or they're pretty nasty and pretty awful. And so Rudy talks to Magda and Stefan and says, "To tell you the truth," said Rudy, "I am looking for a girlfriend suitable for elevation to the position of wife. I wish to marry soon. I'm tired of the junket of girlfriends. I want to settle down." So Magda said, I can't think of a single one of our friends who is the right age, or who has a daughter at the right age either. You may have to arrange this matter yourself. God knows how. "Oh, I am not fussy," said Rudy. "No, you will only want a beauty less than 30 years old, cultivated, if not also rich. It should be quite easy," said Stefan. And then he goes on, which is really interesting, quite funny. Stefan says that he's looking at all the friends that he knows amongst the refos, they call themselves, and he doesn't know that there's anyone that would be suitable. "Ah, you have misunderstood me," said Rudy. "I'm not looking for a refo. I have decided to marry an Australian." "You must be mad," cried Magda. "What do you imagine want with you, an Australian? The cultivated ones are anyway all either married or have gone away." "Gone away?" asked Rudy. "Where have they gone?" "They go to London, Paris, or even Rome. You'll hardly find one here. If you do, she's saving her fare to London. I can guarantee it." "Well then," said Rudy, "I will take an uncultivated one and cultivate her myself. I should enjoy that." And so he ends up, and he does end up with Faye, and they have quite a little sort of fling. And then the other family that is shown in both this one and in the musical are the Crowns, and this is the real Australian family. Mrs. Crown has got a daughter, Patty. Patty's married to Frank, who's a real typical Australian, and Patty's wanted to have a child for 10 years and nothing's happened because he goes off and plays golf. And golf is such a gripping game. And anyway, so Frank takes off, you see, because they had this rather amazing sex scene, which is very amusing, because he gets so overcome by the fact that, she's in a black nightie and suddenly, it's all on, and then he feels as though he's behaved terribly badly, so he's got to go off, you see, and Patty's got two sisters, Joy and Dawn, who both got children, so they're fine. And so she rings up. Mrs. Crown was on the telephone, and it's Patty ringing. "What do you mean you're not coming over?" she was saying. "I've got a big leg of lamb here specially. It's just gone in and I've already done the veggies. What do you mean you're not coming?" Patty shuddered with fright and confusion. This was proving to be more difficult than she'd ever imagined. It was a nightmare. But Frank's not feeling well," she said. He's not up to it." "Frank not well? Never heard of such a thing. Frank's always the picture of health. What's the matter with him?" "Oh, I don't know," said Patty. It's nothing. He just needs a day to himself. He's lost his appetite. He feels cross." "Well, perhaps he needs a doctor. Have you had the doctor?" asked Mrs. Crown. "Oh, no," said Patty. "I don't think he needs a doctor. I'll see how he is tomorrow." And then she began to cry. "Patty Williams, or Crown, or was," said her mother, "I'm coming right over there. Even if the lamb has gone in, I'll turn it off and come right over, even if it is ruined. If you won't tell me what's going on, I'll just come and see for myself. I don't care about the lamb if you don't." "No," sobbed Paddy. "Leave the lamb in. I'll come over. I'll come myself. Just give me a lot of time to get ready." She wasn't even dressed yet. She'd wakened in the empty bed at 6 a.m. and had been sitting almost catatonic with fear and shock in her kitchen ever since, staring at the front page of the Sunday paper. I'll come over as soon as I can," she said. "Leave the lamb in." And so this is the story, and of course it all sort of works out well for Frank and Paddy, and in the end Paddy is going to have a baby at the end. They're not quite sure whether it was this particular night or whatever it was. So the whole book and the musical, and of course you've got some wonderful songs in the musical, and they set there's a amazing sort of scene where it's all about the sales, and that's the January sales, you see, and you've got Miss Cartwright who's in charge of the sales of the department of cocktail frocks, and Miss Jacobs. So I'm playing Miss Jacobs and Mrs. Crown, so it's totally two totally different characters. Miss Jacobs been there for 40 years, and she had a fiancé in the war who died, so there's all this sort of backstory to that. But the January sales are amazing, and there's pandemonium when everyone comes in to buy for the sales. So it's quite beautifully described in here. I don't know whether I've got time. Probably haven't got quite time to read that, but
it sounds lovely.
It's just so.
I can see it being adapted to stage.
Oh, it is, and what really got me was that one or two, or quite a few of the dialogue in the play and the musical is straight from the book.
Oh, nice.
Yes, because Miss Jacobs sort of, says to Lisa, about the fact that she's so delighted that she's going to go on and study literature, and that a clever girl is the most wonderful thing in all creation, and that's word for word from the book. But the sales are just wonderful. They're fighting for their rights to possession of frocks, skirts, jerseys, shoes, blouses, and hats at greatly reduced prices. Who could blame them? Who so much as criticise? They were driven not by any impulse so mere as greed or vanity, by a biological law which impelled them to make themselves fine, and now they hope to fulfil its diktat without at the same time making themselves broke. and it's just delightful. So of course the musical is on stage. It starts on Thursday night, and Joanne Simpson, who's directing it, it was her daughter who was in it, and Ellen, who used to be here in Marston.
One of your former pupils.
One of my former pupils. She was in the show. She was Faye in the show in, I think it was Melbourne or Sydney. I'm not sure where she was, but this is a New Zealand premiere, so it's really lovely, and it's got lots of opportunities for all the cast, and we're all changing characters and changing parts and things. So it's lovely, yeah.
Nice.
So
nice
that
book.
is The Women in Black by Madeline St. John, and will be as a musical Ladies in Black.
And it's interesting because there's a very famous play called Woman in Black.
That's right, which is quite different.
A very different story.
Yes.
So I'm surprised that she brought out a story with such a close name, because that's what I thought it was based on.
That's right, yeah. But also it has been a movie too. So there is a movie. Yes. Oh, right. Yeah, there is a movie of it too. But I think the musical has got, because of the music, Tim Finn's music, and of course we've got an orchestra, and I think it's just brings it to life.
And the costumes for the 50s.
Oh, the costumes have been absolutely amazing. Yeah, they really are. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be just talking just a few little excerpts from this book, which I'm reading at the moment, by Dickie Arbiter, and he was press secretary to Charles and Diana. Mm. He was actually a radio royal correspondent, and he got a phone call one day from Buckingham Palace, wanted to meet with him and offered him this job as press secretary to Charles and Diana.
Oh, gosh.
A very senior position.
Yeah.
In fact, he and his wife and daughter were even offered a grace and favour apartment at Kensington Palace. So you don't get that if you're a minor employee.
No.
And it's also tradition with the Queen, whenever she has new senior staff appointments, they have an audience with the Queen. His went one step further. He was instructed that he was going to Balmoral for the weekend, just after he started the job, on his own. He was flown up to Scotland and taken by car to Balmoral, and he was told to take appropriate clothing for every occasion.
Oh, really?
So when he got there, he was told he had half an hour to get changed because he was going on a picnic. And so he came downstairs, was hovering around the main entrance, and out pops the Queen and Prince Philip, and the three of them load into this Land Rover or Jeep, and the Queen drives them out in this pouring rain to this lodge, and the three of them sit and have this picnic.
Oh,
and he didn't really know what to sort of say to her, and so after they'd finished eating, he said, "How about we do the dishes?" He said, "I'll wash and you dry," he said to the Queen, and she said, "No, I'll wash and you'll dry."
Lovely.
So I just want to read a few excerpts because he had quite an extraordinary career at Buckingham Palace. And first of all, and he went through the period of Charles and Diana's marriage and divorce and her death, and also the fire at Windsor Castle. So probably the most important things that happened in the royal family.
Horribilis, yes.
He says here about Charles and Diana's wedding, much has been written about the presence of Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles in the congregation at St Paul's that day. Simply put, there was no reason why she should not have been there, and every reason why she should have been. There was no animosity between Diana and Camilla, and that was before things went a bit further ahead, I imagine. She was a long-standing friend of Prince Charles. Her husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, played polo with the Prince regularly, and on the wedding day, Camilla's husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, was commanding the sovereign's escort of the household cavalry, which led the Queen's carriage procession. And he says, did Charles and Diana love each other? Yes, they did, he said, and it was readily apparent in those early days. I witnessed many an occasion when Charles couldn't keep his hands off her. He would often rest his hand on her forearm and every now and then give her bottom a light pat when they were out and about on engagements. To suggest that they were never in love is pure conjecture.
Oh, really?
So I think that's nice to hear that.
Yes,
He talks here about Diana's personality, and he says, I had a chance to get to know her well, and in doing so began to understand the kind of person she was. In a word, she was complicated. If things were going her way, she was fine. If anything out of the ordinary occurred, anything that conflicted with what she wanted to do and in her way, then you were frozen out and left to stew until she decided to invite you back into the fold. The freeze could last days or even weeks, and no one was immune. He says here that Diana's private secretary spoke to him one day and said that Diana wanted to hold a reception at Kensington Palace for the England football team. Why, I asked. They lost their recent game. Agreeing, he replied, then why don't you tell her that? Dickie, he said, it would be better coming from you. Okay, he said, but you'll know what'll happen. She'll sulk, and we won't speak until she wants something. Moments later, the princess walked into Patrick's office. We discussed the events of the previous week as well as what was to come. And then Patrick said to Diana, wasn't there something you wanted to ask Dickie, ma'am? Thanks a bundle, says Dickie. Dickie, I want to host a reception for the England football team. What do you think? It's a lovely idea, ma'am, but why? They lost. If you go ahead, then you'll have to give one to the cricket team, the equestrian team, the hockey team, the rugby team, and the list is endless. Not willing to give her a word. No, ma'am, it just won't work. Yes, I see what you mean, she said. That was it. The meeting was over, and she never spoke to me for 2 weeks.
Oh, really?
Lovely. They were talking here about the restoration of Windsor Castle when it burnt down, and there's always been a lot of conjecture about the Queen's wealth and how much she owns and owes and what sort of money she's got. My first wife used to call them the Royal Bludgers, but she was quite happy to accept an invitation to have a dinner on the Britannia once. But in fact, if you look at the figures, it costs each British person about 57 pence a year to run the royal family. And it says here that they were saying, well, the Queen should pay for this herself because it's her palace. But in fact, she only owns 2 residences. She owns Sandringham Estate in Norfolk and Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Everything else is owned by the state, including the yacht, the trains, the planes, the royal collection, the crown jewels, all belong to the state. And she's just the caretaker for them. She was 59th on the rich list in the early 80s and mid-80s, and by 2014 she had fallen to number 285 on the rich list.
Oh, really?
So her personal wealth, what people thought wasn't very high. So it's a lovely book. It's called Dickie Arbiter on Duty with the Queen.
Oh, it sounds lovely. Yes, because he was often on TV. I've seen him on TV.
He then, after they divorced, he became he looked after the collection of the Queen, which was her art and her porcelain. And so it's a great book.
Thank you, Graham. And once again, we seem to have come to the end, and we have
hour,
to.
Don't we?
We do need an hour with all the exciting things that we've been reading. So thank you very much. You've been reading about Dickie Arbiter. I've been talking about Women in Black, which has been translated into The Ladies in Black, which is a musical at Matt's Theatre over the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much.
Lovely.
And the next time we will be on will be in a couple of weeks' time. Someone else will be doing.
Us again next week on repeat.
That's right. See us repeat. Anyway, thank you. You've been listening to Bookworms.